dive into tell us who you are, how you got started with this whole writing thing, and then we can talk about it being more than a trilogy.
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, Mark Timmony. I live in Sydney, Australia. I have been reading fantasy for many years now. I started when I entered what was my high school. I discovered in the library The Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, first book of the Dragonlance Chronicles.
Mm-hmm.
And that just, I'd always liked books, but I'd never, been a big reader. And then I found that book and I never looked back. It was like all the things that I imagined, my daydreams of dragons and wizards and knights and some of the cartoons that I'd watched was like in a book form. And that was amazing. And from there, I just started searching. So obviously I found The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And it was at the time that David Eddings was really big, and Raymond E. Feist, and even the early Dune books. And yeah, I just kept reading from there. And it was always something I decided that I wanted to do. I would get so excited by reading these books and these stories and adventures that I wanted to write something that made other people feel like that too. And then I think it was about 1990, maybe 1991, I came across The Wheel of Time, so The Eye of the World, and that really cemented for me that this is what I want to do. This is what I want to spend my time doing: world building, magic systems, creating great sweeping sagas. And so I was one of those people who read Wheel of Time and waited patient or impatiently for each book. So I read it as it was released over the years.
Yeah.
Got Game of Thrones as well. Same thing there. Still waiting for that. But yeah, I fell into that. Funnily enough, I never really got into Dungeons and Dragons or the role-playing games. A lot of people are surprised that I never went that route either. But I guess none of my friends were really into it where I lived, so I was never exposed to that. Obviously, I knew that Dragonlance was part of a campaign setting, and I understood what TSR and, at the time, TSR, then Wizards of the Coast, and Dungeons and Dragons was, but I was never really that captured with the idea of playing a game or doing a role-playing adventure. But then in the early mid-2000s, I discovered World of Warcraft. And I've been playing that like ever since, with only one or two breaks. And that became my version of role-playing games or campaigns. So I guess I like the visual element more in being able to do that and playing those sorts of things. So yeah, big geek. Obviously, I've done all the Star Wars, Star Trek, more Star Wars than Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, all that sort of stuff as well. Never big in sports. I was always in the library during school, reading more books. The idea or the world setting for my Eye of Eternity series began in my final years of school. I've still got Notepad somewhere, probably in my cupboard, that has the original maps and stuff, because I love maps. I always loved maps in fantasy books. I would hand draw my own maps.
Oh yeah.
The map that's in The Blood of the Spear was originally hand drawn by me. I've since handed it over to graphic designers and artists, and they've fixed the rendering, but all of that's my original design. And yeah, I did all of that. I managed to get online and become a member of Jani Wirtz's online forums for the Walls of Light and Shadow sequence. And so I've had lots of conversations with her over the years, and she was kind enough to blurb Blood of the Spear for me. So that was really cool. Got lots of writing advice through the years from her as well, just in general, passing on the knowledge, paying it forward type stuff. And yeah, loved the political side of the Empire trilogy she did with Feist. I thought that was amazing. Kind of closest I've ever come to that is Game of Thrones. So there's not a lot of well, for me, the type of skullduggery and political machinations that went on in those books are kind of more my cup of tea than I found elsewhere. The closest I can find is Game of Thrones, but very different settings. So it's all the sort of stuff that I'm trying to bring into Blood of the Spear. Doesn't really show in the first book, but I'm about probably 2/3 of the way through book 2 at the moment, and things are heating up on that front. So that's interesting. Different
cool.
feel in the story for me.
So it sounds like you're definitely a big fan of the longer series. I definitely have never. So I'm working my way through Wheel of Time right now. I took a little bit of a break because I discovered that much later. But I actually have never read Game of Thrones. I watched the first season and it was a little too much blood and guts and that kind of stuff for me. But then, with him not finishing the last book, I'm just kind of waiting. So I'll read it, but I'm like, I'm nervous to start it and then be waiting for the book and all that.
Yes, showing my age, I grew up in that era where you waited for books to finish. Like they weren't all, released every 6 months. Like sometimes it'd be 18 months, 2 years before you get the next book. And reading a big series that translated to years of waiting, decades. And so that's okay. There's always something else to read in the meantime, maybe not as for me, not as exciting as the book I was waiting on, but we'd get there. So I used to have this absolute desperation, I've got to get the next book. I can't wait for the next Game of Thrones book to come out. I've got to read it. And now that I've seen the whole series, and I understand that there's going to be differences between what was shown on TV and the path of, he's already said one of the characters has gone a completely different path to what he'd originally said the plot was to the writers of the TV show. And so there are changes that are going to be happening, but the actual main thrust of the story and what happens, presumably, at the end is basically the same. So now I'm like, well, I know what happens or where the story's going. I get now what's going to go on. So that entire that whole eagerness for the next book, it's there, but it's also whenever
a little diminished.
Around, it's fine. Yeah, it is. And look, to be completely honest with you, I thought that the last book was hugely overwritten, and there were entire characters was an entire character and storyline that started and ended in the book, and I was kind of like, what? I've been waiting for so long for this book. What was the point of that particular story that needed to be in there? I didn't understand. So, different choices. And by the time the next book comes out, I guess it will have been a couple of years since the show has finished and since I read Dance of Dragons, or With Dragons, whatever it's called, that, it will be a little bit new, won't be as fresh in my mind. So, go back in.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a brilliant writer. His writing is so good. So if for no other reason than to read his sentences is enough to read the book. And I think the TV, certainly the first season, was true to the book, but I don't recall it being as, blood and guts as they depicted. I mean, it probably was, and you just don't get the same impact in your head, or you gloss over it a bit. But it is probably more adult in many ways in terms of themes that are presented than perhaps Wheel of Time was in the novels. And